Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to today's newspaper review. I'm Chidera Esum, and I'll be taking you through the stories dominating today's newspaper headline. Firstly, the New Telegraph. On the New Telegraph in page 2, 4, 14, 16, and 28, it is written, Tinubu to Nigerians. Federal government won't surrender to terrorist bandits. This is coming from President Tinubu to Nigerians, that federal government won't surrender to terrorists and bandits. To get that story, go to page 2, 4, 14, 16, and 28 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, IATA ranks Nigerian, Afghanistan, tough places to float airlines business. To get that story, you go to page 4, where IATA ranks Nigerian, Afghanistan, tough places to float airlines business. At the bottom of the newspaper, on Oyo adoption, NAF deploys surveillance aircraft to track Oriri victims. The Oriri is where they adopted the Oyo school children and teachers. So the NAF, that is the Nigerian Air Force, has deployed surveillance aircraft to track those who have adopted our students and teachers. To read more on that story, go to page 4, 5, 7, 8, and 29 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent, which is boldly written, how Mid-East crisis is driving up inflation caused in Nigerian. The crisis happening in Mid-East, that is Oyo, Kwara, and the rest of other Mid-East, has driven inflation, that is the high cost of living in Nigeria. At the top of the newspaper, troops rescue 360 adopted women, children in Gwoza. Gwoza is in Borno State, and the troops has rescued 360 women and children that have been adopted in Gwoza, Borno State. To read more on that story, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, on page 29, police arrest 4 suspects linked to adoption of Adelabu's sister. Yesterday, the police arrested 4 suspects linked to adoption of Adelabu's sister, which the Adelabu sister has also been released. To read more on that story, you go to page 29 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Punch. On the Punch in page 2 and 6, it is boldly written, states rush to deploy forest guards as insecurity deepens. So the states have deployed forest guards to concerning the insecurity that has deepened in Nigeria. So the states have rushed to deploy forest guards that will fight against the insecurity that is happening in Nigeria. At the top of the newspaper, federal government slashes ministers' impress to 700,000 naira. The federal government has slashed ministers' impress to 700,000 naira. To read more on that story, you go to page 7 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, federal government clears 5 months allowance arrears for lecturers. So the federal government has paid the lecturers 5 months arrears allowance. To read more on that story, you go to page 7 of the Punch newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Guardian. On the Guardian in page 6, it is written, debt, oil output, volatility weighing on fiscal outlook despite higher revenue. To read more on that story, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, on xenophobia, federal government approves 5 evacuation flights for 500 screened Nigerians. So our federal government has approved 5 flights to bring back 500 screened Nigerians back to their country. To read more on that story, you go to page 5 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Nigerian Tribune. On the Nigerian Tribune in page 225 of the newspaper, which is boldly written there, troops rescue victims in Borno, Plateau, and Kaduna. The troops has rescued, that is the security forces have rescued victims that have been adopted in Borno, Plateau, and Kaduna. To read more on that story, go to page 2 and 25 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, how we identified adopters, located hideouts, rescued Adelabu's relative. This is coming from the police. They are saying how they are able to identify those who adopted Adelabu's sisters, their hideouts. They're able to locate where their hideout is, and they rescued Adelabu's sister and relative. The rescue happened yesterday. To read more on that story, go to page 3 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, late hour exam. WAEC drops 24-hour delivery policy as 3 officials die in auto crash. 3 WAEC officials died in auto crash, and WAEC has dropped this in a policy concerning late hour exam. To read more on that story, go to page 4 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun. On the Daily Sun in page 6, which is boldly written there, government won't surrender to terrorists, bandits, says Tinubu. This is coming from President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, saying that the Nigerian government won't surrender to terrorists and bandits. He's also saying concerning the recent attacks and adoptions that has happened for some time now. To read more on that story, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on page 8, opposition reps closed ranks to challenge Tinubu's legislative agenda. The opposition House of Representatives has closed ranks in order to challenge Tinubu's legislative agenda. To read more about the Tinubu's legislative agenda, you go to page 8 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Katsina government raises hope on rescue of adopted General Robe wife. So the Katsina government has raises hope in order to rescue the adopted general's wife, Rab. To read more on that story, go to page 8 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Vanguard. On the Vanguard in page 14, it is written there, why cooking gas will remain scarce and expensive. So to know more about why cooking gas will remain scarce and expensive, you go to page 14 of the Vanguard newspaper. At the top of the newspaper in page 14, Consortium of Lenders rejoinder on Nesto. Consortium of Lenders rejoinder on Nesto. To read more on that, you go to page 15 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, on xenophobia, 270 Nigerians arrived from South Africans today. To read more on that story, you go to page 9 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Matrix. On the Matrix, it is boldly written on insecurity. Federal government won't surrender to terrorists, bandits, kidnappers. Tinubu assures Nigerians. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu is assuring Nigerians that federal government won't surrender to terrorists and bandits, kidnappers. We just hope that he keeps to his words. To read more on that story, go to page 2 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on page 3, NUPRC partners NNRA on radiation safety, regularity, efficiency. I'll take that again. NUPRC partners NNRA on radiation safety, regulatory efficiency. To read more on that, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Miss World Nigerian 2026 crown. Miss World Nigerian 2026 crown goes to Bayelsa's Caribe George. To read more on that story, you go to page 23 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Sanwo-Olu, Oyedele business leaders, headline Invest Lagos Summit 3.0. Sanwo-Olu, Oyedele, business and other business leaders, headline Invest on Lagos Summit 3.0. To read more on that story, you go to page 2 of the Matrix newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust. On the Daily Trust in page 4 and 5 of the newspaper, Boko Haram holds teenagers as 360 regained freedom. To read more on that story, you go to page 4 and 5 of the Daily Trust newspaper. And that's all for today's newspaper review. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates. I'm Chidera Esum. Do have a beautiful day.